Licking his lips, Sonny cautiously said,
It's not as you think, Neff. We've been caught in a trap by the Soul Tree. It's not benevolent. It's not protecting us. In fact, it's doing the opposite. If we don't leave this island, we'll become its slaves forever. Or until it finds someone stronger and devours us.
She tilted her head and looked at him with an unreadable expression.
Come on, Nephis. Remember, we've talked about this already. This whole thing was your idea to begin with.
For a moment, he thought that his words had awoken the stolen memories in her mind, but her response shattered those hopes into pieces.
Leave the great tree, you have really lost your mind.
Sonny gritted his teeth in frustration. Changing Star raised her sword and said in a tone that made Sonny tremble,
Let Cassie go now.
He hesitated, thinking about the best course of action. Then he carefully placed the blind girl on the ground.
All right, I did. See? Now listen to me. I have something very important to tell you.
Before he was done speaking, Nephis disappeared from his view. Realizing that he was about to be attacked, Sonny prepared to defend himself. However, a moment later he was already lying on the ground, the tip of the silver sword pressed against his throat. Changing Star was standing above him, pale lights burning in her eyes. The fight was over in an instant. All his training, all the experience he had won in countless bloody battles, all the power he had gained, Sonny had really thought that he stood a decent chance of standing his ground in a fight against Nephis, maybe even reaching a tie. But in the end, he had only lasted a second. One would be tempted to call this shameful display a premature capitulation. Sonny forced himself to think clearly and focus. Feeling the cold steel touching his skin, Sonny tried to move as little as possible. He was pretty sure that Changing Star wouldn't just kill him in cold blood, but it was still better to not give her any reasons to do something drastic. After all, Neff's mind was not all there. Looking up at her cold, indifferent face, Sonny strained his vocal cords and shouted in exasperation.
Aster Song Vale!
Nephis's hand trembled, making a drop of blood roll down his neck. Her eyes opened wide, full of surprise and shock. Then a dark expression appeared on her face. Pressing slightly on the sword, she took a step forward and pierced him with a burning gaze. When she spoke, her voice was trembling with suppressed emotions.
How do you know these names? Who are you?
Sonny blinked, equally as surprised by her reaction. He had thought that these weird words were just a part of some code to jog her memory awake. But, as it turned out, they were not. What were those names? And what could make Nephis lose her composure so completely? It had to be something important. Trying to stay as still as possible, he cautiously glanced at the blade of the sword and honestly answered,
I didn't even know that these were names. It's just what you told me to tell you in case you forget what had to be done. You said if I tell you this, you'll listen to me.
Nephis stared at him, a shadow of doubt appearing on her face for a split second. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by grim determination. Gritting her teeth, she snarled,
Which domain do you belong to?
Sonny had no clue what she wanted him to say, so he just asked.
What's a domain?
She grinned, a maniacal glimmer appearing in her eyes. This was very unlike calm, composed Nephis. If Sonny didn't know better, he would think that a completely different person was standing in front of him. A person that was much more unpredictable and dangerous. Meanwhile, Neff started to speak.
Don't pretend to.
Suddenly, she stumbled, then frowned. It seemed as though Sonny's question touched something in Changing Star's mind, causing a chain reaction. A few seconds passed, each turning her frown deeper. Slowly, the familiar poised calmness returned to her eyes. It didn't seem as though she had remembered everything, but, just as Nephis had promised, it seemed enough to make her listen to what Sonny had to say. He understood it from the fact that she had finally removed the tip of the sword from his throat. She even helped him stand up. Looking at Sonny with a strange expression, she then said,
I really told you those words?
Rubbing his slightly cut neck, he simply nodded. Bloodweave was already busy repairing the damage to his skin. Nephis looked down, then closed her eyes for a few moments. When she opened them again, they were full of resolve.
What do I need to do?
Sonny really wanted to ask her about the meaning of the 3 mysterious names, but decided against it. They had to hurry.
Ask Cassie to summon her staff, then get her into the boat.
Dismissing her sword, Changing Star glanced at him for the last time and walked toward her friend. Somehow, Nephis had managed to talk Cassie into following her and boarding the ghastly vessel. She probably had to lie about a lot of things, but Sonny didn't want to ask, afraid that his flaw would ruin everything. Once the girls were inside the boat, he wrapped his tired body into the shadow and put his hands on the metal hull. Every part of his body seemed to hurt in its own unique way. His mind was utterly exhausted. He forced himself to continue one last push. With a crooked smile, he strained his muscles and pushed the boat toward black water. As the last light of dusk disappeared, submerging the world into absolute darkness, the boat built from the bones of a demon slipped from the ashen sand into the cold embrace of the dark sea. Following Sonny's instructions, Cassie aimed her staff and activated its enchantment, causing a strong gale to fill their modest sail. At first, the boat moved slowly, the mast creaking under pressure. But Changing Star's craftsmanship was meticulous and reliable. The demon's spine held, and little by little, the small vessel began to gain speed. Sunny sat at the stern, controlling the steering oar. In front of them, an endless expanse of black water stretched to the horizon, hiding indescribable horrors in its depths. Behind them, the terrifying soul-devouring tree was slowly growing smaller. Sunny stared at it, feeling a deep sense of regret grip his heart. He wished that he was powerful enough to destroy it. Leaving just like that, without exacting revenge on the ancient monster, filled him with anger. At least he had left it a present. Back at the Ashen Barrow, a candle was burning in a small alcove of stones that protected its flame from wind. Near the candle, a tall pile of dry, fallen leaves was towering over the alcove. It had taken Sunny a long time to gather that pile. He had scoured most of the island, hoping to make it as tall as possible. He had also mixed dry seaweed and the remaining fat of the carapace demon into the leaves. Some time later, the small candle was nearing the end of its life. Most of the wax had already melted, turning it even smaller. Just as the flame was about to go out, it ignited the leaves. After a few seconds, a massive searing bonfire ignited in the middle of the island, illuminating the scarlet leaves of the evil tree. Almost instantly, the black waters surrounding the island surged with movement. Sunny was already too far away to see any of it. He didn't know if the creatures of the dark sea would be able to obliterate the soul devourer. He strongly doubted that the ancient fiend was that easy to destroy. However, with the carapace demon dead and the 3 humans meant to replace him gone, there was no one on the island to protect the gluttonous tree. Perhaps it would be seriously harmed, at least. For now, it was the best he could do. Looking back in the direction of the Ashen Barrow, Sunny gritted his teeth and thought, one day he would become powerful enough to destroy that tree, these monsters, and anyone else who would dare to stand in his way. One day he would become powerful enough to never be afraid again of anyone or anything. Instead, all of them would fear him. He didn't notice that, just as he was thinking these words, Cassie suddenly raised her head and turned in his direction. On her face, a dark expression appeared, soon erased by uncertainty and doubt. In the absolute darkness, a small vessel was gliding on the black surface of a restless sea. Its mast, made of a demon's spine, was straining under the assault of the winds. In the eerie silence of this vast and lightless void, the swift boat cut through the waves like a blade. No sounds could be heard except for the creaking of bones and the crashing of water against its polished metal hull. Sunny sat at the oar, steering the carapace vessel. He was guiding them west. With no moon or stars to show them the path, it was hard to keep the boat on course. But there was a mark left in his mind by the cold and menacing shadow of the crimson spire. Using it as a compass, he was able to navigate the treacherous waters without losing his way. Black skies above, dark sea beneath. With nothing but a thin layer of steel separating them from the tenebrous abyss, they sailed through the night. Below them, countless horrors were hiding in the cursed depths. Several times, Sunny felt gargantuan shadows moving close to the small boat, attracted by the sound of its passing. Powerless to do anything, he had no choice but to tremble in silence, praying that the terrible creatures would turn away. So far, luck was on their side. Perhaps they were too small and feeble to satiate the hunger of these ancient leviathans. A few hours after the start of the voyage, Sunny felt that the constant pull on his mind had begun to wane. His thoughts were slowly becoming clearer, the haze of forgetfulness weakening with each minute. Soon, a ghostly sound of shattering glass resounded in his head. Instantly, the last remnants of the fog that was clouding his consciousness disappeared. He was free from the enthrallment of the soul devourer. Relieved, Sunny couldn't help but smile. However, his smile was weak and hesitant. With the effects of the mind hex gone, his usual sharpness had returned. It felt as though an invisible weight had been lifted, allowing his thoughts to finally flow unobstructed once again. Everything became clearer, as though the whole world suddenly came into focus. It was a wonderful feeling. But with it came a better understanding of how terrifying and precarious their current situation was. They were quite literally balancing on the edge of a hungry abyss, their lives relying on nothing but capricious fortune. The decision to venture into the dark expanse of the cursed sea on a makeshift boat was pure insanity. But then again, there was nothing sane about the forgotten shore to begin with. In this desolate hell, the craziest choice was sometimes the best one you had. Gritting his teeth, Sunny held the oar and stared into the darkness. A few minutes later, Cassie suddenly shifted, making the boat gently sway. She handed the magical staff to Nephis and cautiously moved closer to Sunny, feeling her way through the darkness with her hands. Before Sunny could guess what was it that she wanted from him, he was suddenly caught in a tight embrace. The blind girl hid her face in his chest, hot tears streaming down her face. Sunny froze, stunned and having no idea what to do. He could feel Cassie's body pressed against him and shaking from crying, her hands tightly wrapped around his neck. While he was trying to comprehend the situation, she quietly whispered,
Thank you, thank you.
Feeling extremely awkward, Sunny pretended to clear his throat.
No need to thank me. If it wasn't for your warning, we would still be stuck on that island, so we're even.
Then he raised his hand and awkwardly patted her on the back. Both of them were careful to keep their voices as quiet as possible, afraid that they will attract something from the black depths. Cassie silently cried for several minutes, then finally let go of him. Wiping her face, she pulled her body away and whispered,
I'm sorry.
Her voice sounded a bit strange. Confused, Sunny raised his eyebrows. What is she apologizing for?
I'm sorry too, for, grabbing you back then.
Cassie smiled, and wiping the last tear from her face, turned away to move back to the middle of the boat. Sunny was left alone once again. With nothing to do except for holding the steering oar, he let his thoughts wander. With his mind clear again, many things were worth revisiting. He had to distract himself from the eerie pressure of the endless dark emptiness somehow. Anyway, despite the fact that their experience with the Soul Devourer was nothing short of harrowing, Sunny had somehow managed to end up considerably better off on the other end of it. His haul this time was truly unbelievable. He had received an amazing new weapon, no less than 100 shadow fragments, and 2 new attributes. Spark of Divinity was a real improvement over its previous version. The ability to perceive the inner structure of memories alone opened a whole new horizon of possibilities. However, he was more interested in the mysterious bloodweave. Somehow, Sunny felt that he had severely underestimated the uniqueness and importance of that attribute. Its origins, too, were covered in a veil of secrets. Who was that weaver whose ichor he had consumed? Who were the unknown that even the spell was reluctant to mention? What was their connection to the gods? Why were the type and rank of the initial memory he had received from the vile thieving bird's spawn left empty? How was it even possible for a memory to give an awakened new attributes? That last question guided him to think of something else. Glancing up, he stared at Nephis and tried to recollect their conversation. Looking back, she had revealed a lot of things that he had failed to notice in the moment. First of all, Sunny now knew that Cassie's enchanted armor, which had been given to her by Changing Star, was an awakened memory of the 6th tier. That meant that it came from an awakened terror, a nightmare creature 1 class above Mountain King that he himself had killed in his first nightmare. The secret of how Changing Star had managed to earn her true name was now 1 step closer to being revealed. Apparently, as far as accomplishing the impossible went, Nephis had outdone even Sunny. An aspirant triumphing over an awakened tyrant was already unbelievable enough. But killing an awakened terror gave the word unbelievable a whole new meaning. No wonder her aspect ability is so versatile. Now he was almost sure that Changing Star's aspect was of the divine rank, just like his. That would explain why she was able to both heal and destroy with her strange and formidable powers, a combination as rare as his own shadow control. What's the probability of 2 sleepers with divine aspects ending up so close to each other in the dream realm? Close to 0. It seemed like the unpredictable fated attribute had twisted the strings of fate once again. Sunny felt shivers running down his spine. His innate attribute was capable of bringing both terrible curses and incredible blessings. At first glance, their meeting with Nephis seemed like the latter. But, if it was truly the result of fated manipulating destiny, it could turn out to be the worst of calamities in the end. After all, one of the possible meanings of her true name was Star of Ruin. The fear he had felt in that short moment before crossing swords with Nephis was still fresh in Sunny's mind. And there were other things that she had revealed, too. She apparently knew something about the drop of ichor, being that she had called it a lineage memory without batting an eye. That suggested that Nephis knew much more about the spell than Sunny and the rest of the public did. It seemed as though there were secrets in the upper echelons of Awakened that they didn't want anyone else to know. The 3 mysterious names she had told him might have been another of these secrets, and that last word she used, asking which domain he belonged to. What were these domains? So many questions. Sunny spent many hours pondering them, as well as going over all the information about the forgotten shore he had gathered. The carapace boat flew over the dark water, drawing closer and closer to the western horizon. Soon he felt that the night was already drawing its last breaths. The light of hope ignited in Sunny's heart. However, this was when their luck had finally run out. The disaster came unexpected, violently throwing them into a void of confusion. This time, Sunny had not felt anything approaching the boat. The danger simply appeared out of nowhere, leaving him no time to react. 1 second, the black waters were calm and clear. The next, they were boiling with movement, grotesque tentacles rising from them and wrapping themselves around the hull of the boat. Sonny tried to jump to his feet, but at that moment the whole vessel was violently jerked to the side. Falling, he heard the moans of metal being bent and torn apart. Then salty water filled his mouth. Rising, he caught a glimpse of Nephis standing at the bow of the boat, her silver sword lashing out at the approaching tentacle. However, blinded by darkness, she failed to notice a different threat. Another tentacle twisted and coiled around her body. Then, without even a scream, she was gone, dragged into the dark depths with no hope to return. All that remained was a long blade stuck helplessly in the bulbous flesh of the massive tentacle. Sonny's eyes widened in disbelief. No, this can't be happening. The hull of the carapace vessel was then crushed and torn into pieces, throwing him into the cold black water. For a moment, Sonny was stunned by the coldness. Then, wrapping the shadow around his body, he swam up, trying to reach the surface. Soon he succeeded and spun, trying to see something, anything, to give him hope. But there was nothing around, only undulating waves and twisting tentacles, except for... Far in the distance, Sonny noticed an unclear shape rising above the water. He strained his eyes, trying to discern its nature. Then his heart skipped a beat. A few hundred meters away, a giant stone hand towered above the surface of the sea. Its palm opened as though trying to embrace the sky. It was slender and delicate, carved by the unknown sculptor with almost inhuman skill. If Sonny didn't know better, he would have thought that the hand belonged to a living, breathing being. But all of this didn't matter right now. All that mattered was that he had a chance to survive. Straining every muscle in his body, Sonny dodged a twisting tentacle and swam toward the hand, moving as fast as he could. But then he suddenly stopped and looked back. Misshapen pieces of metal and bone, all that remained of their boat, were floating on the surface of the dark sea. He had seen Nephis being pulled under the water by the tentacles of the unknown creature, but Cassie, clad in her enchanted attention-repelling tunic, had a chance to escape. He couldn't just leave without at least trying to find her, or can I? A dark thought appeared in Sonny's mind. After all, his own survival was the only thing that really mattered. Everything else was just a distraction. Why don't you think about yourself for a second? Are you really going to risk your precious life on the off chance that this helpless girl is still alive? He hesitated. Admit it, she is nothing but a burden. You always knew that one day she was going to drag you down. Yes, he did, but what? You're going to die, fool. Turn around and flee now. Why was he even hesitating? This was his chance to escape, his only chance, perhaps. He had to survive. Feeling an almost unbearable feeling of regret filling his chest, Sonny slowly inhaled. Then he gritted his teeth and dove down, heading back to the spot where their boat had been destroyed. What are you doing? Have you lost your mind? He couldn't see in the black water, but his shadow sense was still somewhat effective. He had a chance to feel Cassie's presence, at least if she wasn't already dead and dragged to the bottom of this cursed abyss. You fool, how is she worth it? Why are you doing this? Grimacing, he forced his annoying inner voice to shut up. In his mind, the answer was clear, because I want to. Because he wanted to. For once, Sonny's heart wasn't full of fear and despair. Instead, it was filled with defiant indignation. He was tired of bending under the pressure of the world, furtively clutching to the tiniest glimmers of hope, always afraid, always willing to do anything, abandon anything, just to survive for another day. It wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to make the world bend to his wishes instead. He wanted to live like a human being instead of an animal. In these past months, Sonny had changed without even noticing. Somehow he had grown unsatisfied with his previous way of life, one where his sole goal of survival at all cost overshadowed everything else. Whether he lives or dies had always been the only thing that mattered. But now, how he lived mattered more. What was the point of having no master if he lived like a slave? Gritting his teeth, Sonny dove into the dark abyss. The cold water embraced him like a burial shroud. He couldn't see in this cursed blackness, relying only on his shadow sense for guidance. Salt seeped into the bite marks on his hands and the cut on his neck, making them burn. Not paying the agony any attention, Sonny used his considerable strength to propel himself deeper and deeper into the darkness. He could feel the giant tentacles moving in the water around him, pulling the pieces of the carapace boat into the gargantuan maw that was hiding somewhere far below. Once or twice he had to desperately twist his body to avoid being touched by one of them. But still no sign of Cassie. His lungs were starting to burn. Sonny dove deeper. At this depth, the water pressure was starting to affect his movements, making each stroke feel heavier. Even with his body enhanced by the shadow, there was a limit to how much it could withstand. Sonny suspected that without the blood weave, he would have suffocated a long time ago. What's worse, he felt as though he was getting closer and closer to the actual body of the unknown horror that had destroyed their vessel. He still couldn't sense its massive shape, but judging by the girth of the tentacles that surrounded him, the monster couldn't have been far. And then Sonny finally noticed something. A short distance away from him, a small shadow was struggling against a much larger and ferocious one. Cassie! Gathering all his strength, Sonny swam toward the blind girl with as much speed as he could muster. As he drew near, he could discern the details of what was happening. Cassie was being pulled down, a smaller tentacle coiled around her body. She was still struggling, trying to get free, but her movements were growing weaker with each second. She was suffocating. Filled with fury, Sonny propelled himself forward and grabbed onto the tentacle, feeling slippery flesh throbbing in his grip. If he had any choice, he would have avoided touching that thing at all costs. But fighting underwater was tricky. If he wanted to deliver any sort of a powerful blow, he had to find some form of support first. Summoning the Midnight Shard, Sonny strained every muscle in his body and slashed across the tentacle, right below the point where it was coiled around Cassie's lower torso. He knew that he wouldn't be able to do any serious harm with that strike, which was slowed down to a crawl by the burdensome resistance of the black water. However, his amazing sword was still sharp enough to cut into the fleshy tentacle, causing a cloud of dark blood to gush out of the wound. The tentacle furiously twitched and shot sideways, as though trying to shake the attacker off. Flying through the darkness, Sonny held on for dear life and moved his blade upward, slicing the spongy flesh apart. He never hoped to chop the tentacle off with one strike. No amount of strength would have allowed that to happen. Luckily, swords were able to pierce, slash, and cut. Pushing the blade, Sonny cut deep into the tentacle. When the Suba was about to touch the wound, he changed his grip and pulled the Tachi down. The monster's flesh spread apart under the razor-sharp blade, barely offering any resistance. A torrent of blood surged out, and with the last push the tentacle was completely severed. Sonny was finally able to turn his attention to Cassie to see how she was doing. What he sensed made him scowl. The blind girl was barely conscious. He needed to get her to the surface as fast as possible. Pushing away the twitching remains of the tentacle, Sonny dismissed his sword and grabbed Cassie across the torso, feeling how cold her skin was through the thin fabric of her tunic. Weakly, she tried to resist, not realizing that it was him and not the monster. Pressing the blind girl to his chest, Sonny turned his head up and felt a wave of desperation crashing against the walls of his mind. His lungs were in agony, no air whatsoever left in them. His body was slowly losing its strength, full of terrible pain and thirsting for a breath of fresh air with maddening intensity. Even if he could see anything, at this point, his vision would have begun to darken, and they were so far away from the surface. What's worse, the horror of the depths was now alerted to his location. Countless tentacles were already moving, surrounding them in an impenetrable barrier of flesh. A second or two later, they would be crushed to death in the devastating embrace of the sea monster. Sonny didn't know how to save them, but he wasn't going to give up no matter what. Making an arduous stroke with his one free hand, he held tightly onto Cassie and swam up. The tentacles were approaching, blocking all paths of escape. Sonny gritted his teeth and waited. In the next moment, the water around them suddenly turned pure white. An incandescent radiance filled a vast expanse of the cursed sea, obliterating any sign of darkness. The explosion of light was so intense that it pierced through Sonny's eyelids and hurt his eyes. It was as though a miniature sun had ignited somewhere far below them, turning the endless black abyss into a pristine white void. Tidal currents of radiant water surged tumultuously, throwing the world into disarray. The gargantuan tentacles convulsed and writhed madly as though in the throes of unbearable pain. The unbreakable barrier of flesh fell apart. Sonny wasn't about to let this chance go. Straining his suffocating body, he swam to the surface, dodging the writhing tentacles. With the furious white sun burning in the depths below, he could see their shapes clearly. Moving faster and faster, he propelled himself up with everything he had left. Sonny knew that surfacing that fast was dangerous, but there was no other choice. Both Cassie and himself did not have a lot of life left in them. They needed air. Although it seemed like an eternity, the white radiance began to dim just a few moments later. But it didn't matter. Sonny was already past the barrier of tentacles, swimming up with desperate speed. He was afraid that they wouldn't make it. His consciousness was already beginning to wane, slowly slipping into the cold clutches of empty nothingness. Even knowing that there was nothing but water around, he was still overwhelmed by the suicidal desire to open his mouth and inhale as deeply as he could. His muscles were spasming, devoid of oxygen for too long. And then finally, Sonny's head broke the surface. He drew in a gasping breath and coughed uncontrollably. Held tightly in his arms, Cassie was doing the same. Her chest was ruggedly moving up and down, sucking in the sweet ambrosia of air. Sonny never knew how precious it was before, not even while being slowly poisoned by the harmful, polluted air of the outskirts. They made it. Trying to compose himself, Sonny looked around. The last remnants of the white radiance were long gone, erased as if they had never existed. The world was once again consumed by absolute darkness. However, far away in the east, the first light of dawn was about to shine from beyond the horizon. Catching the glimpse of the giant stone hand, Sonny gripped Cassie's shoulders and swam in that direction. Sonny felt that he was at the end of his rope. He had put himself through too much abuse during these last few days. Now it was hard to even remember when was the last time he had slept. A day before climbing the soul-devouring tree in search of a special fruit, perhaps. Since then, he had lived through the harrowing torture of the bloodweave transformation, spent countless hours on the verge of mental collapse to resist the effects of the enthrallment, mangled his hands to stay lucid, guided the boat through the terrors of the dark sea in absolute darkness, saw it being destroyed by the horrid dweller of the deep, and gave battle to that monster in the cold black depths, almost drowning as the result. His body and mind were on the brink of shutting off. Despite that, Sonny stubbornly continued to swim, bringing himself and Cassie closer and closer to the giant stone hand that was rising from the water, as though trying to embrace the skies. The dark sea was surging around him, still reeling from the effects of the light explosion that had rocked it some time earlier. Tall waves were threatening to drown the two sleepers, throwing them around like toys. Struggling against them was a hard task, and still he persisted. The dawn was drawing close, but for now there was still nothing but cold, darkness, and danger all around them. Any second, something could rise from the depths of the abyss and put an end to their desperate attempt to save themselves. At least the tentacles were gone, perhaps scared away by the pain of being exposed to the searing light. By some miracle, Sonny eventually managed to reach the stone hand. Hoisting Cassie up, he helped her climb on the dark rocks and followed closely behind. Soon they reached the open palm of the hand and crawled to its center, then fell down, utterly spent and exhausted. For a long time neither of them was able to talk. All Sonny could do was lay motionless, draw in raspy breaths, and try to stay awake. His mind was empty of thoughts. That was fine, because he didn't want to think. If he did, he would be forced to remember what had happened to. Shut up! What was the point of remembering? He couldn't change anything. The sound of the black water crashing against the base of the giant hand reminded him that the night was still not over. Opening his eyes, Sonny tried to understand their current circumstances. Their shelter was slightly raised above the waves, the base of the giant thumb almost touching the surface of the dark sea. The palm was not very spacious, roughly half the size of the circular platform that had saved his life on his first day on the forgotten shore. It was angled upward, creating a slight slope. The fingers were higher above waves and wide enough to accommodate a person, but they were bent upward toward the sky, making them less suitable to serve as a refuge. We need to get further away from the water. With that thought, Sonny tiredly stood up and bent down to touch Cassie's shoulder.
Cassie, stand up. We have to move higher.
His voice sounded hollow and brittle. The blind girl flinched and raised her head, her skin deathly pale.
Sonny?
He nodded.
Yeah, it's me.
She was still in shock. Sonny could see that Cassie's mind was not all there yet, so he gently pulled her to her feet.
Come on, let's go. It's just a few meters.
She lingered.
What happened? I heard a sound, and then something was pulling me down.
He gritted his teeth and tried to keep his tone even.
We were attacked by a sea monster. The boat was destroyed. I dove down and managed to find you, then swam to this pile of stones. It's not very high above the water, so...
Cassie wavered.
Where's?
Sonny hurried to interrupt her, unwilling to answer the next question.
Come, follow me. We can rest when we're higher.
Gently guiding the blind girl, Sonny climbed to the base of the giant hand's index finger, which was the highest point they could reach without climbing the fingers themselves. Sitting down on the cold stone, he rested his back against the giant phalanx and stared at the restless surface of the dark sea. His eyes were cold and empty. Cassie was silent by his side. Her pale face was contorted, as though she simultaneously wanted to ask the question and dreaded the answer. Finally, gathering her courage, the blind girl whispered, her trembling voice barely audible.
Sonny, where is Neff?
He stayed silent, not willing to speak the words out loud. Stupidly, he felt that if he spoke them, they would become the truth. But if he didn't, there was still a possibility that they were a lie. I'm not answering. A few moments later, the familiar pressure appeared in his mind. The pressure grew and grew, making his head spin. I'm not. Then the piercing pain came. Sonny stubbornly endured it. He lasted for much longer than he had ever done before, keeping his mouth shut until hot tears rolled from his eyes, his whole body shaking from the terrible suffering. But eventually he was still forced to say those bitter words.
She's gone.
Before he could say more, a subtle sound attracted his attention. Out there, at the base of the giant thumb, where the cursed sea was almost touching its stone surface, a pale white hand appeared from the black water and grabbed onto the rocks. Then, a tall figure slowly pulled itself onto the open palm of the stone giantess. His eyes widened. Feeling that something was wrong, Cassie turned her head and asked,
Sonny, what is it?
He trembled and whispered, gripped with sorrow.
It's Nephis.
An uncertain smile appeared on the blind girl's face.
Neff? She is all right?
Sonny found himself unable to answer. No, Nephis was not all right. In fact, he didn't know how she was even alive. The Starlight Legion armor was shattered and torn, revealing the mutilated flesh beneath. There was a horrifying gaping wound on Changing Star's torso, looking as though almost half of her right side was missing. Sonny could see the sharp shards of broken ribs, the rivers of blood streaming down her legs, and the mangled mess of viscera spilling over the edges of the wound. He wanted to close his eyes. Another large chunk of flesh was missing from her thigh, exposing the shredded remnants of muscle and the white surface of the femur, cracked and barely holding together. Her right arm was severely damaged, too. In fact, it was almost torn off, hanging only by a narrow strip of skin and a few tendons, like that of a mistreated broken marionette. Even her face was not spared. One of Neff's eyes was gone, its socket crushed and shattered. The skin of her cheek was shaved off as though by sandpaper, leaving behind a mangled mess of bleeding flesh and broken teeth. The sight of her was harrowing and heartbreaking. It was apparent that Changing Star was about to die. Sonny, why are you not answering? He glanced at Cassie and bit his lip, trying once again to suppress the answer that was fighting its way out. Something sharp and hot was stabbing at his heart, making his vision blurry. Meanwhile, Nephis staggered and blindly stepped forward. Her legs buckled, and she heavily fell to her knees, splattering blood all over the cold surface of the stone. A terrible moan escaped from her lips as her cracked femur finally shattered, bone piercing through muscle and skin. Sonny felt as though he was thrown into his worst nightmare. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. A deep, almost physical pain was tearing him from inside. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to see this. And yet he couldn't look away. That's why he noticed instantly when two white flames ignited in Neff's eyes. The radiance grew brighter and brighter, spilling from her eyes, her mouth, the gaping wounds in her body. It was as though there was a flaming star burning in the place where her heart should have been, as though she was nothing but white flame hidden behind a thin layer of human skin. The incandescent radiance filled Changing Star's blood, turning it into streams of liquid white fire. As Sonny watched, frozen in place with his eyes opened wide, that fire began to melt and reshape her flesh. Slowly, her muscles repaired herself, her organs returned to their places, her bones reassembled themselves from the shards. Where there was nothing to replace a missing part, the fire took its shape and solidified. With a terrible scream, Nephis grasped her almost severed arm and tore it away, then pressed it to the stump that was bleeding with white flame. Soon the mangled halves melted together, becoming whole again. Shocked, he saw every terrible wound on her body heal, washed in the purifying fire. Soon there was nothing but pristine white skin showing through the wide gaps in the shattered armor. Nephis raised her head, looking at them but not seeing anything. There was no recognition in her gaze, all understanding destroyed by the cruel crucible of the sacred fire. Then the last daughter of the immortal Flame Clan closed her eyes and fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Finally, the first rays of sunshine appeared from beyond the eastern horizon. The dawn was coming. In the end, Nephis had remained unconscious for an entire 2 days. On the 3rd day, she finally opened her eyes and slowly rose, looking around with subtle confusion. Her face, as usual, was calm and indifferent. However, she did flinch a little when her gaze fell on Sonny, who was sitting at the top of the giant hand's index finger and grinning from ear to ear at her. Frowning, Changing Star looked herself over, noticing the embarrassing gaps in her armor, and said,
Why are you smiling?
Sonny gave her a mischievous wink and shrugged.
Look behind you.
Lingering for a few seconds, Neff sighed and turned around, wondering what is it that he wanted her to see. Behind her, a dark expanse of land was rising above the slope of the colossal crater, and on it, a tall city wall built of gray polished stone was towering over the giant chasm of the abyss. It looked ancient but still impenetrable, able to withstand the crushing pressure of the dark sea for 1,000 more years. They've made it. They had found the human castle.